Okay, so we're now doing part two of our notes over Reconstruction in Arkansas. We left off with part one with the re entering of Arkansas into the Union. They adopted a new state constitution and ratified the 14th Amendment and was once again a part of the United States. That was your forever date of 1868. Arkansas re enters the Union. Also in 1868, you see a new gubernatorial election. This time it is a man named Powell Clayton. Clayton is what was known as a carpetbagger governor, and we're going to look at what carpetbaggers were, as well as just the names given to certain types of individuals present and active during Reconstruction. So Clayton's a carpetbagger governor, and as you can see, he was originally from Pennsylvania. So carpetbaggers during Reconstruction were people from the North who came to the South after the Civil War to and then served in office and gained political power. They were termed carpetbaggers because oftentimes a carpet bag was a form of luggage during this day and age. And the term is meant to be derogatory, and yet many carpetbaggers were quite successful politically across the South during Reconstruction. Clayton was a Union cavalryman, and he was a Democrat in the North, but a Republican in the South. And we'll talk about kind of where that comes from in a few slides. But his ideals were very much aligned with both parties. His goals while in office were to improve the economy, to end the violence that was still taking place in the state, to protect black rights, and to strengthen the Republican Party in the state of Arkansas. The economy of Arkansas had suffered greatly during the Civil War. Uh, and even in the aftermath of the war, with the end of the war, there was still a lot of looting and just general day to day violence taking place throughout the state. As a Northerner, Powell Clayton was very much in favor of protecting black rights. And as a recently converted Republican in a state with a very short history of Republican dominance, he was trying to secure a foothold for the Republican Party in the state of Arkansas. Clayton's plan for improving the state economy is his economic program. The points of his economic program were to raise property taxes, that is, taxation on things like your house, your land, farmland specifically. Nowadays, when we have property taxes, it's on items like our houses, but also cars, boats, vehicles, larger things that can be classified as property. And so by raising property taxes, he is getting a higher source of revenue income for the state. He also led an immigration campaign. So immigration had slowed to a crawl during the Civil War. And so in response to this, he printed 15,000 brochures in an attempt to attract more settlers to the state of Arkansas. Like Elias Conway before him, Clayton also constructed levees designed to control flooding or to mitigate flooding. The problem with Clayton's levees is that they were accused of shoddy construction and corruption. And corruption is something that we'll talk about later in our slides, but was very common during Reconstruction. And the last piece that Clayton does is another common theme during Reconstruction, and that is the construction of railroads or the improvement of infrastructure. During Clayton's administration, you see 662 miles of railroads constructed at a cost of $9 million to the state of Arkansas. It is during the second half of Reconstruction that you see the emergence of some of the longest lasting effects of Reconstruction. And perhaps the most famous of these would be the arrival of groups like the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan was formed in 1866 in Pulaski, Tennessee, and we should note that even though it began as a white supremacist group or uh, a American natural rights group. It did not start as a terroristic organization, but it quickly devolved into that. And they resulted to attacking former slaves and Republicans, very much as a fear tactic group or a scare tactic group. They were designed to, or were based around the idea of true ideal of what an American should look like. And they promoted scare tactics and attacked those that disagreed with their ideal. And the Klan will arrive in Arkansas by 1868. Coincidentally, this is the same time we were having a state election, and many men of violence, that is, men that were active with the Ku Klux Klan, sought to influence the election with violence. Perhaps the most famous incident of an Arkansan that was the victim of this violence would be Thomas Heineman. Heineman is assassinated on September 28, 1868. He's killed at his home in Helena for encouraging voting rights for free slaves. You have to remember, Heineman was the military governor for the Confederacy during the Civil War. He was the military governor of the state. But it is because he is advocating voting rights for free slaves that the Klan lashes out against him and murders him. Perhaps even more famous is the assassination of Congressman James Hines. Hines was a federal congressman. He was assassinated 1 month after Heineman was, and he was also a carpetbagger from Minnesota. So he is a Republican congressman, and he was the biggest proponent of black voting rights. Truly a national figure. He's killed in Monroe County while campaigning for Ulysses S. Grant, who was running for president at that time. And Hines will be the highest ranking official murdered during Reconstruction, not only in the state of Arkansas, but nationally. And so this is a national event that takes place in our state. Again, murdered because he argued for things that were not in line with what the Klan was trying to accomplish. During the 1868 election, Ulysses S. Grant will defeat Horace Seymour. Grant was a Union general. In fact, he was the leader of the Union forces at the end of the Civil War, and many people credit him for the ultimate defeat of the Confederacy. Interestingly, though, there are some voting irregularities with the election of 1868. Governor Clayton of Arkansas refused voter registrations from 12 counties. One county had 0 voters, and one county did not even send a result. And this is especially interesting because Grant only wins the state by 2,000 votes. It would not have made that great of a difference in the total electoral votes, but you have to wonder how much of a role Republican sentiment in the South played in Grant's victory. In the aftermath of the 1868 election, Clayton will place Arkansas under martial law for a third time since the Civil War, showing you that even though the war was over, Southern sentiment and bad feelings over the Civil War were still very much alive in the South during this time. It is during Grant's administration that you see a split in the Republican Party. And this split will emerge between two different groups. You have the radical Republicans, we talked about in our previous lesson, and they are, Grant is a radical Republican, and they gain the nickname the Old Guard or the Stalwarts because they stand very much for what the Republican Party at the end of the Civil War stood for. At least that's what they argue. The other group are the liberal Republicans. So in our previous video, we talked about the moderate Republicans like Lincoln and the radical Republicans. Now we have the radical Republicans and the liberal Republicans, or as they come to be known, the half-breeds. And they were called half-breeds because they were half Republican, half Democrat. They agreed with about half of each party's agenda. And initially, the term half-breed was designed to degrade these men, but they will take this name and wear it as a badge of honor, signifying that, yes, they are about 50-50 in terms of how much they agree with each side. In Arkansas, you see radical and liberal Republicans, but they're known by different names. The radical Republicans are known as minstrels, and the liberal Republicans are known as the brindle tails. And each of these parties will play a major factor in our next gubernatorial election. In the 1872 gubernatorial election, you have two Republican candidates running against each other. You have a man named Joseph Brooks, who was the brindle tail or the half breed Republican candidate, who was a carpetbagger from Iowa. So, again, he's from the North and he has come to the South in the aftermath of the Civil War. And he advocated for universal suffrage, universal amnesty, and honest men in office. So he wants voting rights for all, he wants equal rights for all, and he wants honest men or a end to corruption in office. And he will quickly gain support from the Democrats as that half-breed candidate. He's about half Republican, half Democrat. His opponent is a man named Elisha Baxter, who is a minstrel and a scalawag from North Carolina. So we've been talking about carpetbaggers and how they were men from the North that came to the South after the war to take advantage of the South. Scalawags were essentially carpetbaggers from the South. They were from the South, they supported the Union, and they will essentially betray the South in order to gain political power during Reconstruction. And so you have Brooks and Baxter against each other during this election. Baxter runs with a very similar platform and will be elected in the 1872 election. He will win the election, but again, there are voting irregularities, and those irregularities and the disagreement over those irregularities leads to the Brooks-Baxter War. In 1873, a Pulaski County judge rules that Brooks, not Baxter, was the true governor. And this is going against the results of the election. In response to this, both sides formed militias to determine who the true governor was. The African American community was split because both men were Republican candidates, and the Republican Party were the supporters of African American rights at that time. Hercules King Cannon White actually led a Black Baxter force. And so many prominent African Americans or members of the African American community stepped up during this time to voice their opinion in the conflict that would come to be known as the Brooks-Baxter War. President Grant stepped in eventually and declared that Baxter was the true governor. So the winner of the initial results, Baxter, was named governor. Brooks, as a consolation prize, was given the title of Postmaster of Little Rock, another prominent position. In 1874, Arkansas voted once again to pass a new constitution. This time, the Constitution, although very similar to the previous Constitution, did not take any rights from former slaves or Confederates, which is the true difference between the previous Constitution and the Constitution of 1874. The previous Constitution punished many Confederates for their actions, while the 1874 had no provisions against Confederates. It also reduced power of the governor and forbid high taxes against the citizens of Arkansas. 2 years later, you have the 1876 presidential election between the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and the Democrat Samuel Tilden. And this election, like other elections we've talked about today, will have its own voting irregularities. In the election of 1876, Tilden will win the popular vote and the Electoral College. However, there are 20 electoral votes that are disputed. And this was a major issue because whoever received these 20 disputed votes would have the majority required to win the election and become president. This was of great concern to many people because a Democrat had not served as president since prior to the Civil War, and it was the Democratic Party, more specifically the Southern Democratic Party, that had led the movement for secession prior to the Civil War. And so many people, particularly Northerners, feared that a Southern Democrat or a Democrat in general would lead to the undoing of the accomplishments of the Civil War and of the Reconstruction period, specifically the rights gained by African Americans, as well as the possibility that the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery would be repealed. Ultimately, the votes were awarded to Hayes in an 8-7 vote because the committee members there were 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats, so they voted along party lines. The only reason the Democrats accepted this is because they negotiated the removal of Union troops from the South. In what's known as the Compromise of 1877, Hayes was given the electoral votes he needed to win, but at the cost of Union troops leaving the South and the end of Reconstruction. And you also see the return of the Southern Democrats, who are then referred to as the Redeemers because they are redeeming the South from the oppressions of Reconstruction. The Democratic Party would go on to control the South for the next 100 years, really until the 1980s. And in order to explain that, I think it's a really good idea to look at the cartoon on the left. So in the cartoon on the left, you have 2 distinct images. The first is displaying the strong, and I put strong in quotes, the strong government of 1869 to 1877, which would be classified as the first stages of Reconstruction. And during that time, in this image, you see 2 Union soldiers escorting a carpetbagger that is riding the back of the Solid South. And on the carpetbag is scrawled bayonet and carpetbagger rule. The term Solid South is used to describe the voting bloc that existed prior to the Civil War and even today. The South tends to vote together in national elections. For many years, it was a Democratic voting base. Recently, it has shifted to a Republican voting base. But this image shows how, in many Southerners' minds, you have the first period of Reconstruction is seen as Northern and federal oppression of the South. They're kept from farming themselves. They're kept from doing anything. It is a time of stagnation and not of growth in the South. On the right-hand image, you have the, again in quotes, weak government of 1877 to 1881, and that is the Rutherford B. Hayes presidency. And in that image, you have a man that strikingly resembles Hayes, depicted as a Southern farmer that is plowing the earth with his let him alone or home rule policy. And he is plowing not only the earth, but he's plowing over the carpetbagger. You can see just the corners of the carpet bag poking out of the earth in this image. And so you can see how many people saw Hayes and the end of Reconstruction as kind of the true start of the South returning to its previous form and glory. So at this time, we do need to stop and reflect on Reconstruction and the positives and negatives associated with it. There are 3 main takeaways from Reconstruction that can be seen as positive. The first would be infrastructure improving, speaking specifically about roads, bridges, railroad systems, and even the controlling of floods with levees. So the general accessibility of the South and Arkansas improved greatly during Reconstruction. Additionally, you see education reform make its way to the state with the establishment of the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville and the University of Arkansas in Pine Bluff, 2 longstanding institutions that are made during Reconstruction. And lastly, and probably the most important, would be the constitutional reform. You have the 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery, the 14th Amendment that secures the rights for all citizens, and then the 15th Amendment, which at this time secured the right to vote for all men, with women's suffrage coming a few decades later. There were also downsides to Reconstruction, though, two specifically. The first would be corruption, specifically in the administration of President Grant. Grant's administration suffered greatly from corruption, specifically the corruption of many individuals in his administration, oftentimes without President Grant knowing. Many times these scandals would pop up without him even being aware that the scandals or that the actions were taking place, and yet it was his reputation that suffered because of it. The second and more important piece of this would be the fact that Reconstruction could not secure the rights of African Americans permanently. Many African Americans during the earliest stages of official Reconstruction, so starting in 1869, had rights. They had the right to vote, the right to own property, and there were even some black congressmen that served in the federal government. Yet, after Reconstruction, although not immediately, many African Americans will lose their rights rather quickly and will not gain them back really until the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Okay, that is all of our notes on Reconstruction. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and contact me. But at this point in time, you should be able to take and complete your second open note quiz of the week. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week and a wonderful break. Thanks, guys.